Good morning, everyone. So I am the Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Sodexo in the UK and Ireland, and I'm one part of a coalition that we've got working on the topic of gender pay gap, because I think, as we've heard this morning, there's some really key areas that need to be addressed with the work that we're doing in this space. And I think diversity and inclusion and the representation of women in different levels within the hierarchy is kind of one part of teams that need to be brought together to actually get to a place where we can report in an accurate and easy to understand way. So I'm really pleased that I've also got my colleague Mark Goodyear in the audience with us today. So Mark gets all the difficult maths questions when we get to the Q&A bit. I get the bits about what we're doing from a gender diversity perspective, and particularly what we're doing to promote women into senior roles. So that's the deal for this morning. So in terms of the approach that we've taken within Sodexo, we did a bit of a dip test, and we first published a gender pay gap number back in November 2016. And so some of what I'll be sharing with you today is a bit about how we did that and some of the learnings that we've had as we've gone along that journey. And I have to say that my presentation, completely unintentionally, is actually going to reinforce quite a few points that we've heard this morning from others around actually communication. So perhaps if I just start by saying a few words about our business. So Sodexo are an organisation which is actually massive, but we're an organisation that people don't necessarily recognise as a well-known brand. So we're an integrated facilities management company, which means that we offer services like catering, cleaning, gym and facilities management across a whole range of sectors. And those sectors would range from education, corporate, government services, healthcare, etc. So I have heard it said that Sodexo looks after people from cradle to grave, but personally I don't particularly like that expression, so it's not one that I use too frequently. But just in terms of our organisational mission, what we want to do is we want to improve the quality of life for the people that we serve and also for our own employees. And so that means that having a real focus on people is a really key element of our business strategy. And just to give you a sense of the scale and scope of Sodexo, we employ some 430,000 employees globally. About 34,000 of those folks are within our UK and Ireland business. And we have about 75 million customers every day, which every time I say it always makes me kind of have a sharp intake of breath. So that leads us to some really interesting challenges particularly around diversity and inclusion, but also around how we communicate on our approach to reducing the gender pay gap. So if we think about our folks in the UK and Ireland, so 34,000 people, they're actually spread across many different client sites. And so when we're in those sites, we are essentially guests. And so one of the things that's really important to us is taking a partnership approach to the work that we do in this space, and that's something that I'll come on to talk a little bit more about. So in terms of our context and challenges, as I've said, we're a large geographically dispersed organisation, and there's also a perception that our industry is quite male-dominated. So people think about senior management in the facilities management industry. And, as Kieran was saying, people, I think, immediately have that unconscious bias that person is going to be a man. And so that's one of the challenges that we have is trying to break down some of those assumptions. We've also got an incredibly diverse range of individuals who work with us. And that means that we need to take differing approaches to communications. So I loved Biba's presentation earlier around thinking about how we segment those different audiences. And that's certainly something that we've learnt from as we've gone through our journey on this to date. And I think it's something that we will be continuing to focus on. So many of our employees are customer facing. So they're not people who are sat behind computers and looking at emails all day. And so that means that we need to think a bit more creatively about how we get messages out, any messages, not just diversity and inclusion messages. But I think particularly with things like the gender pay gap, it is really important that all of our employees have a sense of, actually what the gender pay gap is and how it differs from equal pay. And that's one of the things that we've learned a bit about so far, and I'm sure we'll do many more kind of conversations with employees in the coming months. I think, the other thing, and we've talked a bit this morning about transparency, but as an organisation, it is sort of one of our key ways of working is that we do want to be as transparent as possible about the work that we're doing in this space. And we do also have a long-term commitment to gender balance. And I think, as we've said, that's going to be a really important bit of our narrative going forwards. The gender pay gap is one element of that approach. It isn't driving the approach, and I think that's a really key thing that will stand us in good stead for the gender pay gap reporting requirements going forwards. So in terms of that sort of commitment, what does that look like? Well, our global CEO, who you can see on the screen there, a guy called Michel Londell, he set up a group called SWIFT all the way back in 2009. And SWIFT are a group of our most senior men and women globally, and they come together to promote gender balance across the organisation, so across our different business segments and across our different levels within the hierarchy. And so we're in a really fortunate position that gender balance is sort of up there with that senior level of support, and that through the structure he's created, we do absolutely have advocates across the different countries in which we operate, and a steering committee who work on a number of key initiatives. So SWIFT particularly focus on leadership development, flexibility, networking, communication and HR processes. And through the work that they do in regard to each of those, it actually looks at some of the reasons for the gender pay gap. And for me, that's really key is, it's not just about the number that you come up with, but it's actually how you've got to that number and what you're going to do to reduce it further. So just to give you a bit of a sense of how some of these initiatives play out globally, from a flexibility perspective, as I think other speakers have said this morning, we know that sometimes flexibility can be positioned as just a women's initiative. So people think flexibility and unfortunately they think working mum. While sometimes that's the case, actually we know that flexibility can be good for everybody. And I think particularly we know that the younger generations, it's actually an expectation. And so if we're not providing that as an organisation, we're going to have wider talent attraction issues than just gender. So we've got a number of initiatives that look to showcase people who are working flexibly, people who have perhaps worked flexibly at different points within their career. Because again, I think, as it's been said this morning, flexibility can sometimes be seen as a one-way track. Perhaps you have children, perhaps you engage in a flexible working arrangement for another reason, but actually it's important to think about how we bring people back, how we allow people to perhaps go from working part-time to then working full-time if that's what they actually want at that stage in their life. So then if I think about networking, the work that SWIFT does to promote the development of employee network groups enables us to give our employees the access to role models. And I think particularly in areas where we would normally see occupational segregation, that access to role models is really critical because it helps people to see that actually they could do a job that perhaps they'd historically thought of as kind of a man's job. So they do some really good work there, and that's both on a global level and then also on a local level. And then I think in terms of communications, that's led to some really interesting research, which I'll come on to share with you, around actually what's our internal business case for gender balance. And then just covering off quickly the final one there in terms of leadership development, one of the things that SWIFT have launched is a positive action programme looking at how we develop females into very senior level positions within our organisation, and with a particular slant on women in operational positions, because again we know that there tends to be an assumption that those operational positions will be taken by men, and we need to do more to encourage gender balance within those roles. So as an organisation, I guess many of you in the room will be familiar with the McKinsey research, and I know Sam shared it this morning. But we got to a place where actually we realised, because of our scale and scope as a business, we had an opportunity to not only rely on some of that external research, which sometimes, dare I say it, people can be a little cynical about. Actually, we had an opportunity to use our massive employee population to really test the impact of gender balance within our own organisation. And so we undertook a really comprehensive research exercise which crossed 50,000 managers across 90 of our entities. And what we found is that there was an optimal balance around gender. So I think often we hear people talk about the 50-50 split, and that to me feels like a bit of an arbitrary number. You know, I think we can all aspire to get to 50-50, but the reality is if you've got an executive team of 11, then how do you kind of work that 50-50? You can't cut a person in half, so how does that kind of work? But what our research actually found is that the 40 to 60% in either direction was the optimal balance within our organisation. And I'm going to read the results because they always shock me, even after a couple of years of now presenting this research. So what we found is that where there was that 40 to 60% balance within the management teams, and when I say the management teams, I mean the whole management team, not just at the executive level, what we found is that those entities were 13% more likely to report consistent organic growth, were 23% more likely to show an increase in gross profit, and they also performed better on, some would say, the softer measures, so things like brand image as measured by our clients, employee engagement, client satisfaction and client retention. And so what this research has given us the opportunity to do as an organisation is to very much frame our approach around that aspiration to at least get to 40% female representation. So taking that kind of global view to a UK and Ireland level, which is, you know, obviously really critical when we're thinking about the gender pay gap reporting requirements, which will be on all of our organisations. Well, we've got a number of structures in place to support us with this work. So we have a Diversity and Inclusion Council, which includes individuals from each of our business areas, and they really help us to sense check communications, to help us to communicate things into the business that require a more human approach. And I think this is an area where clearly there's a need for them to be engaged and supporting us with the gender pay gap communications. And then we also have work streams, which are the kind of red boxes that you can see there on the screen, which focus on disability, cultures and origins, gender, generations, etc. And within some of those work streams, we also have employee network groups. And our experience with the gender pay gap stuff that we've done so far is that those are really critical stakeholders for us. We can use those groups to sense check our messaging and to understand how it will land in the business. Because I think with the best will in the world, Mark, myself and others can think that we know how something's going to land, but actually it's only when we really share that messaging with people and give them the opportunity to ask us those awkward questions to kind of go, I'm not sure that quite makes sense to me, that we can really make sure that this message is simple enough that everybody understands it, and not on the second or third read, actually just they understand it immediately from the comms which is sent out. So, hopefully I've kind of set the scene in terms of our context and the work that we've been doing around the gender pay gap and gender balance for a number of years. So I think, you know, for us, the gender pay gap reporting is just one element of our approach. Essentially, the gender pay gap is just a measure of where the men and women are within your organisation. So if you know that you've got a 50-50 balance, as I know somebody in the audience was telling me earlier today, actually your gender pay gap shouldn't be looking too bad. It should be looking in quite a good position. Whereas if, like many organisations in the UK, you see that there's more men within those senior management positions, your gender pay gap is going to be bigger. And I think, you know, bringing it down to that simplistic level is incredibly helpful, because as we've said many times, people get really confused between equal pay and the gender pay gap. And I think that was absolutely our experience when we shared some of our messaging internally, is we needed to get back to basics. What is the gender pay gap before we were actually able to communicate what our gender pay gap was and sort of how it compared with the national average. So, as I've said, we've got an internal coalition, and I know that phrase is slightly going out of fashion, but that is sort of one of the top tips that I would give to any of you in the room who are perhaps starting out on this journey, is think about the skills that you've got in the organisation. I'm going to out myself as somebody who is not a spreadsheet. I don't like spreadsheets. That I cannot imagine anything worse than that. Whereas my colleague Mark, I'm told, really loves spreadsheets. And so, you know, it makes sense that we work together on this, because the numbers are just one part of the story. The narrative is just one part of the story, but it's actually bringing those parties together that I think is really going to make this work impactful. And I think, you know, in addition to that, I think there's absolutely a role for communications and PR teams to play in this and helping to ensure that those messages land as we would want. So I've talked a little bit about gaining some stakeholder insights, and I will share with you that when we pulled together our messaging for the release that we did back in November 2016, that was obviously ahead of the legislation, what we found is that people didn't know the difference. And so we kind of sat in a bit of a dark room, we scratched our heads and thought, how do we communicate this in a way that's really simple? And so we actually came up with an infographic to explain the difference. So equal pay essentially being, as we've heard this morning, people doing the same roles or roles of equivalent value being paid the same, whereas the gender pay gap is obviously about the position of people within your hierarchy, within your organisation. So I think we got to version 28 on this, and that's no exaggeration, because actually we kept going around the houses trying to get it into the simplest form possible. So this is publicly available. Feel free to steal and use in any of your own communications that you are pulling together, because I think, I think there's that phrase, isn't there, that a picture speaks a million words, and that was certainly our experience when we then went back and sense-checked this with people. Suddenly people went, oh, right, okay, I understand that now. That's a much simpler way of presenting it. So again, and again, I think previous speakers have spoken about the importance of kind of external relationships on this. And I think, we've been really fortunate that we've worked quite closely with some of our external partners. So Kieran and others at ENEI, Business in the Community, Forset, etc. But also the Government Equalities Office. So for Sodexo, this isn't sort of something that's happened quite recently. It's something that we've been working on with GEO for a number of years, responding to their consultations and supporting them in the work that they're trying to do, and indeed we're trying to do through the Think Act Report initiative back in, I think that was 2012, which doesn't seem that long ago. So that's a little bit about our external relationships. And I guess that you've been able to see from the infographic that the number that we reported on was 7.65. So that was a median gender pay gap number, and it was in line with the ONS statistics. So that will be slightly different when we report post-April. But I think the point that was made around having that comparative number is so important, because I think if you're somebody on the street and perhaps you're just getting your head around what equal pay and the gender pay gap is, having any number, it doesn't really make any sense unless it's set in some kind of context. And so in the absence of having the really detailed legislation, as an organisation, what we decided to do is to use that ONS comparison so that we could give our employees a sense of actually where we were relative to other organisations. So, we've also done quite a lot in terms of press releases, and I think being quite conscious around the individuals who are giving those messages, as Biba shared with us earlier. So I think, we've started the journey. There is still so much more for us to do as we get into the details of actually producing the numbers. Glad that's not me. And then, putting the more detailed narrative around it. But really what Sam asked me to do today was just to kind of share with you some of the work that we have done, and I'm really happy to sort of answer any questions. I think it's becoming much clearer what the causes of the gender pay gap are, and I think there's a real opportunity for organisations to work together actually in terms of tackling some of those. I think we know that this isn't just an organisational issue. As Kieran says, it's essentially a societal issue, and actually we need to kind of work collectively to actually try and fix and challenge some of those expectations, unconscious biases. I think there's probably not a day or two that goes by where we don't hear stories of boys and girls being conditioned in certain ways and towards certain roles. And I think we've got a real opportunity with this legislation to start to challenge some of those things and to look beyond the walls of our organisations into, what are we doing from an education perspective. And I think, one of the really interesting things in that space is not only what are we doing to educate our kids, but what are we doing to educate parents? Because actually, how often do we hear that perhaps boys and girls have gone home and said, actually, I'd like to, be an astronaut, or I'd like to be a doctor. And I think it's very easy for parents to say, that's not a job for you. So I think, there are really big societal opportunities that we've got here. And I think, what I'd encourage everybody in the room to think about is not only what your numbers are and what the narrative is for your own organisation, but actually how you can use this as an opportunity to kind of contribute to some of that societal change. So just to wrap up, in terms of top tips, I would absolutely advocate for having a project team working on this. I think it's a lot for one person to take on, and I think there's some very different skill sets that are required. Again, you know, following up from what Biba said earlier, I think there's a real opportunity to educate, communicate. And I think it's certainly something that we'll be continuing to do in the run-up to coming out with our full statistics in line with the legislation, is making sure that people understand the differences between equal pay and gender pay gap before you release any further information. And I think that goes both internally and externally. Our experience is we've had some kind of media interviews around this, and I think there is still work to be done in terms of educating people outside of your organisational walls around what the difference is, because I think if we don't have a media in the UK that understands the difference, I think it's going to make anything that does come out in the press actually quite confusing for people, and I think that's not going to be good for any organisation. So again, I think the more that we can do to collectively influence the media and help them to understand, the better all of this is going to be for all of us. And then just to repeat, in terms of that partnership approach, there's an opportunity for us to do things that are outside of our organisational walls, in addition to the stuff that's within them.
Thank you very much, Megan. That's really comprehensive. And I think that came across when we met, actually. You had the whole team there in the room talking about it. It was really obvious that you had that kind of project team approach, and I think that was really positive, because the quality of the discussion and the kinds of things that we were all thinking about in the room, it really kind of worked well. Has anyone got any specific questions for Megan before we go to the actual discussion part of our day? Yes. There is a microphone here if anyone's running. Oh, here we are, it's just coming to you. No, we need it for the recording.
Thank you, Megan, that's very interesting. Can I ask, while we're at it, collecting the data for gender pay gap reporting, I have a bigger issue I perceive in my organisation on BAME pay gap. Mm-hmm. Would you encourage organisations, while they're mining the data, to look at inclusion, exclusion issues for gender pay gap, to also look at other areas of concern and maybe be bold enough to publish them?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think for things like ethnicity, and I guess the same would apply to other characteristics, say disability, sexual orientation, etc. My experience, and I've done this role now within 3 different organisations, so prior to working for Sodexo, I used to work in financial services. And I think my experience has always been that HR data in relation to those other protected characteristics just isn't as good. So from a kind of legislative perspective, we need to understand what people's gender is for pension purposes, but actually things like your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, and whether you have a disability, actually they're things that you choose to disclose to your organisation. You choose. So essentially that means that the data set doesn't tend to be as good. And I guess from my perspective, I would question whether having that data in a pay gap figure would really tell you anything that you don't already know. So given that the pay gap is essentially a measure of where people are in your organisation, if you know that you don't have a good representation of black and ethnic minorities, for example, in senior management positions, then you know you're going to have a big gap, so what's the point in measuring it?
Fair enough. Any other questions? No? Okay.